The words came out casually, almost as an afterthought, the way devastating things often do. Gene Simmons looked at Ace Frehley across the studio mixing board and said something he probably thought was just a joke, just a throwaway observation. "You know the difference between you and me, Ace? I'm a real musician. I studied music theory. I can read charts. I understand composition. You're just a guy who got lucky with a guitar." The studio went silent. The engineer pretended to be very interested in his levels. Paul Stanley, sitting on the couch in the corner, suddenly found his shoes fascinating. And Ace Frehley, the space ace, the guitarist who'd helped build one of the biggest bands in rock history, felt something inside him break so completely that it would take 20 years to even begin repairing it. He didn't respond. He didn't argue. He didn't defend his musicianship or his contributions or the fact that his self-taught instincts had created some of Kiss's most memorable guitar work. He just quietly set down the guitar he'd been holding, walked out of the studio, and made a decision that would haunt Gene Simmons for the next 2 decades. From that moment forward, Ace stopped talking to Gene about anything that wasn't absolutely necessary for the band to function. It was late 1982 at the record plant in New York City. Kiss was recording what would become the Creatures of the Night album, their attempt to prove they could still be relevant in a changing music landscape. The sessions were tense, complicated by the fact that Peter Criss had already left the band, and Ace was clearly on his way out, though no one was saying it directly yet. Gene and Paul were trying to modernize Kiss's sound, bringing in session musicians, layering production in ways that buried the raw edge that had made them famous. And Ace, whose guitar playing had been central to Kiss's identity, was increasingly being treated like a liability rather than an asset. Gene Simmons had always been intellectually arrogant. It was part of his persona, part of what made him Gene. He'd studied at Sullivan County Community College, had been a 6th-grade teacher before Kiss, prided himself on being more educated and sophisticated than the average rock musician. He could read music, understood theory, approached songwriting with an analytical mindset that served him well in the business side of the industry. And he'd never been shy about letting people know he considered himself smarter than most of the people around him. Ace Frehley, on the other hand, was entirely self-taught. He'd grown up in the Bronx, picked up a guitar as a teenager, learned by listening to records and figuring things out by ear. He couldn't read music, didn't understand formal theory, had never studied composition in any academic sense, but he had something that no amount of formal training could teach: an instinctive understanding of melody, an ability to create guitar parts that were instantly memorable, a tone and style that was uniquely his. Everything Ace played came from feeling, from intuition, from someplace inside him that connected directly to his fingers without needing to go through intellectual analysis first. For years, this difference between Gene and Ace had existed without causing major problems. Gene would occasionally make little comments about Ace's lack of formal training, usually framed as jokes, and Ace would shrug them off. It didn't matter that he couldn't read music when he could create solos that made audiences lose their minds. It didn't matter that he didn't know theory when his guitar work on songs like Shock Me and Cold Gin had become iconic. The proof was in the music, in the success, in the fact that fans didn't care whether their favorite guitarist had a music degree. But by 1982, the dynamic in Kiss had shifted in ways that made Gene's intellectual superiority complex more damaging. Gene and Paul had consolidated power, made themselves the decision-makers, the businessmen, the brains of the operation. And increasingly, they'd started treating Ace not as an equal partner, but as a talented employee who needed to be managed. Every decision Ace made was questioned. Every creative choice was scrutinized. His lack of formal training, which had never mattered before, was suddenly being used as evidence that he didn't really understand what he was doing, that his successes were accidents rather than the result of genuine musical ability. That day in the studio, they'd been arguing about a guitar part. Ace had recorded a solo for one of the new songs, something that felt right to him, that served the song in ways he couldn't articulate but knew instinctively worked. Gene had wanted it changed, wanted it more technical, more complex, more theoretically correct. Ace had tried to explain why his version worked better, but he didn't have the vocabulary to discuss it in the terms Gene wanted. He couldn't talk about harmonic progressions or modal scales because he didn't think in those terms. He thought in sounds and feelings, in what fit the emotional content of the song. Gene had gotten frustrated with Ace's inability to explain his choices in theoretical terms. "How can you defend your playing if you can't even explain what you're doing?" Gene had asked, his tone condescending. "Real musicians can articulate their choices, can explain why they made the decisions they made. You just play by feel and hope it works out." "It does work out," Ace had said quietly. "That's why we're successful. That's why people love the songs." "We're successful because of the marketing, the vision, the business strategy," Gene had replied. "The music is almost secondary at this point, and the music we do make needs to be professional, needs to be technically sound, needs to be something that can be explained and defended on musical grounds, not just, 'It feels right.'" That's when Gene had delivered the line that would end their friendship for 20 years. "You know the difference between you and me, Ace? I'm a real musician. I studied music theory. I can read charts. I understand composition. You're just a guy who got lucky with a guitar." The casual cruelty of it was what made it so devastating. Gene hadn't said it in anger. He'd said it as simple fact, as obvious truth that didn't even require discussion. In Gene's mind, there were real musicians who understood what they were doing. And then there were people like Ace who stumbled into success without actually deserving it, without actually understanding the craft they were practicing. Ace had felt the words like a physical blow. This was Gene Simmons, his bandmate of nearly a decade, someone he'd traveled the world with, created music with, shared success with, and Gene genuinely believed that Ace wasn't a real musician. Believed it so completely that he could say it casually, almost thoughtlessly, the way you'd comment on the weather. The engineer, Bob Ezrin, who'd produced the session, later said it was the most uncomfortable moment he'd ever experienced in a studio. "You could feel something break in that room," Ezrin recalled in a 1995 interview. Ace's face just went blank. He set down his guitar very carefully, very deliberately, and walked out without saying a word. Gene didn't even seem to realize what he'd done. He just turned back to the mixing board and kept working like nothing had happened. But Paul knew. You could see it in Paul's face. Something important had just been destroyed. Ace didn't come back to the studio that day, or the next. When he finally did return, he was professional, competent, completely shut down emotionally. He played what he was told to play, accepted the changes Gene and Paul wanted without argument, and then left as quickly as possible. The creative partnership, the collaborative energy that had made Kiss's early albums special, was gone. Ace had become a hired gun in his own band, going through the motions, because contractually he had to, but investing nothing of himself in the process. But the real damage wasn't in the studio. The real damage was in what happened next. Ace stopped talking to Gene about anything beyond the absolute necessities of band business. No casual conversation, no joking around, no friendship. When they were backstage before shows, Ace would be polite to everyone except Gene, with whom he was merely civil. When they did interviews together, Ace would respond to questions but never engage with anything Gene said. The warmth, the camaraderie, the sense that they were in this together, all of it disappeared, replaced by a cold professionalism that was somehow more devastating than open hostility would have been. Gene didn't understand what had happened. From his perspective, he'd made an observation that was factually true. He did have formal training. Ace didn't. What was the problem? When Ace started giving him the cold shoulder, Gene initially thought Ace was being oversensitive, childish, unable to handle simple truth. It would take him years to understand that the problem wasn't what he'd said, but what it revealed about how little he valued Ace's contributions, how easily he dismissed years of creative collaboration as getting lucky. By early 1983, Ace had left Kiss. The official story was about creative differences and wanting to pursue solo work, and those things were true. But the real reason was simpler. Ace couldn't stay in a band where one of the leaders genuinely believed he wasn't a real musician, couldn't wake up every day and go to work with someone who thought his successes were accidents, his abilities were luck, his contributions were less valuable because they didn't come from formal training. The years that followed were complicated for both of them. Ace pursued his solo career with varying success, struggling with addiction and finding his identity outside of Kiss, but he also found validation in unexpected places. Other musicians sought him out for collaborations, praised his unique style and instinctive musicality. Slash from Guns N' Roses cited Ace as a major influence. Eddie Van Halen called Ace underrated and brilliant. Ace was learning that Gene's definition of real musician wasn't the only one that mattered. Gene, meanwhile, continued building the Kiss empire. More albums, more tours, more merchandising. Kiss became as much a brand as a band. Gene became wealthy beyond anything he'd imagined, but something was missing. The guitar players who replaced Ace were technically proficient, professionally trained. Everything Gene had implied a real musician should be, but none of them captured what Ace had brought to Kiss. None of them had that instinctive feel, that ability to play simple things that somehow stuck in your head for decades. When Kiss reunited with the original lineup in 1996 for an MTV Unplugged performance and subsequent tour, Gene and Ace found themselves working together again after more than a decade apart. The reunion was driven by nostalgia, by fan demand, by enormous money being offered. But it was awkward because nothing had been resolved. Ace still wasn't talking to Gene beyond what was absolutely necessary. Other people in the Kiss organization noticed. Doc McGee, who managed the reunion tour, later said, "Everyone could tell something was off between Gene and Ace. They were professional on stage, but off stage. Ace treated Gene like he didn't exist. Would talk to Paul, talk to Peter, talk to crew members, but the second Gene tried to engage, Ace would shut down. There was some deep wound there, but neither of them was talking about it." Paul Stanley knew what had happened, but he'd stayed out of it. "That was between Gene and Ace," Paul said in a 2010 interview. "I'd witnessed the moment when it broke, but I couldn't fix it. Gene had to fix it himself, and he didn't seem to understand there was anything to fix. For years, Gene genuinely didn't get why Ace was so cold to him. He'd forgotten what he'd said, or more accurately, he'd never thought it was important enough to remember." The breaking point came in 2003, backstage at a concert in Los Angeles. The reunion tour had long since ended, but Kiss was still performing with various lineups. Ace had come back for a brief stint, partly for the money, partly because despite everything, some part of him still loved playing in Kiss. But the coldness toward Gene remained, as solid as it had been 20 years earlier. Gene finally confronted it. He cornered Ace in the dressing room after a show, tired of the silent treatment, tired of not understanding what he'd done to deserve it. "We need to talk," Gene said, closing the door. "This has gone on long enough. What did I do? What happened that made you hate me?" "I don't hate you," Ace said, his voice level, emotionless. "I just don't like you. There's a difference." "Why? What did I do?" Ace looked at him for a long moment, deciding whether to even have this conversation. Finally, he spoke. "You told me I wasn't a real musician. You said I just got lucky with a guitar." "That was in 1982, in the studio when we were recording Creatures of the Night. Do you remember that?" Gene's face went blank. He clearly didn't remember. The moment that had defined Ace's relationship with him for 2 decades, Gene didn't even recall. "I said that?" "Yeah, you did. And you know what the worst part was? You said it so casually, like it was just obvious fact, like after all the years we'd played together, all the songs we'd written, all the success we'd had, you genuinely believed I didn't deserve any of it because I couldn't read music." "Ace, Gene started, but Ace cut him off. "The worst part isn't that you said it. The worst part is that you don't even remember saying it. It was so unimportant to you, so throwaway, that you forgot. But I remembered. Every word, every implication. You made me feel like a fraud in my own band, like everything I'd contributed was worthless because it didn't come from formal training." Gene sat down heavily on the couch, processing this. 20 years of coldness, 20 years of distance, all because of something he'd said and then forgotten. "I was wrong," he said finally. "If I said that, I was completely wrong." "You said it," Ace confirmed. "And yeah, you were wrong. But that's not even the point anymore. The point is that you thought it. That's how you saw me, as someone who got lucky instead of someone who worked at his craft, just in a different way than you did." I was an elitist snob, Gene said quietly. I thought formal training made someone a real musician, and anything else was less valid. That was stupid and narrow-minded, and I'm sorry. Are you? Ace asked. Or are you just sorry I've been cold to you for 20 years? Gene thought about this. Both, probably. But mostly I'm sorry because I was wrong about what makes someone a real musician. Formal training is one path, but it's not the only path. And honestly, some of the most musical moments Kiss ever had came from you, from your instincts, from your ability to play things that felt right, even if you couldn't explain why they worked theoretically. I should have respected that. I should have valued it instead of dismissing it. You should have, Ace agreed. But you didn't, and that's why we haven't been friends for 20 years. Can we be now? Gene asked. Or is that door permanently closed? Ace didn't answer immediately. He looked at Gene, this man he'd known for more than 30 years, and tried to find some remnant of the partnership they'd once had. Finally, he said, I don't know. You hurt me, Gene. You made me question my worth as a musician at a time when I was already struggling, and you did it casually, thoughtlessly, because you genuinely believed formal training made you superior. That's hard to forgive. I understand, Gene said, but I want to try. I want to make this right, however long it takes. That conversation didn't immediately fix anything. Trust broken over 20 years couldn't be repaired in one night. But it started a process. Gene began publicly acknowledging Ace's contributions in interviews, praising his instinctive musicality. In a 2007 interview, Gene addressed the formal training issue. Some people think you need music school to be a real musician. That's garbage. Ace Frehley never studied formally, but he has more musicality in his little finger than most formally trained players have in their entire body. That's real musicianship, and it took me too long to recognize it. Ace, hearing about these comments, started to soften. Not quickly, not dramatically, but gradually. By 2010, they were actually talking again, having real conversations instead of just professional exchanges. The friendship wasn't what it had been in the early days, probably could never be that again, but it was something. A mutual respect born from years of distance and hard-earned understanding. In 2014, at Kiss's induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Gene's speech included a section about Ace that made it clear how much he'd reconsidered his earlier arrogance. Ace Frehley plays guitar like no one else. He doesn't need to read music because he speaks it fluently in a language that comes from somewhere deeper than theory. He's a real musician in every sense that matters, and I was an idiot for ever suggesting otherwise. Ace, standing on stage with the rest of Kiss, had nodded slightly. It wasn't full forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. The wound was old enough now that it had scarred over, and while scars don't disappear, they stop hurting as much with time. The lesson of that 1982 studio session isn't really about music or formal training. It's about something more fundamental. It's about how casual dismissals can create wounds that last decades, how words spoken thoughtlessly can destroy relationships that seemed unbreakable, how intellectual arrogance can blind you to other kinds of intelligence, other kinds of talent, other ways of achieving excellence. Gene Simmons learned that being able to read music doesn't make you a better musician than someone who plays by ear. It just makes you a different kind of musician. And that dismissing someone else's path because it's not your path doesn't make you superior. It just makes you narrow-minded. He learned this lesson slowly, painfully, at the cost of 20 years of friendship with one of the most talented guitarists he'd ever worked with. Ace Frehley learned something too. He learned that external validation doesn't matter as much as self-knowledge. Gene, calling him not a real musician, had hurt because part of Ace had believed it, had internalized the idea that formal training was more legitimate than instinct. But over time, through collaboration with other musicians, through the respect he earned from his peers, through the enduring popularity of the guitar work he'd created, Ace learned that his way of making music was just as valid, just as real, just as valuable as any formally trained player's approach. The story continues today. Kiss still performs, still tours, still generates enormous revenue from their brand. Gene and Ace interact when their paths cross with a cordial respect that acknowledges both the history they share and the damage that was done. They're not close friends, probably never will be again, but they're no longer enemies. They're two men who learned hard lessons about words and wounds and the long road to reconciliation. And somewhere in the Kiss catalog, in songs like Cold Gin and Shock Me and Rocket Ride, Ace Frehley's self-taught, instinctive, feeling-driven guitar work stands as permanent evidence that formal training isn't what makes someone a real musician. Heart makes you a real musician. Soul makes you a real musician. The ability to connect with millions of people through your instrument makes you a real musician. And by every one of those measures, Ace Frehley was always the real thing, whether Gene Simmons understood it or not. This story is based on documented accounts of tensions within Kiss during the early 1980s and the complex relationships between band members. Conversations have been dramatized while staying true to what actually happened and the documented evolution of Gene and Ace's relationship. This narrative was created with AI assistance to bring these historical moments to life. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been dismissed for not following the proper path, if you've ever said something casually that destroyed a relationship, if you've learned that there are many ways to be excellent at something, share this. Tell your story in the comments. Subscribe for more stories about the wounds that define us, the reconciliations that heal us, and the long journey from arrogance to understanding.